Welcome to Crossroads. I'm your host, Joshua Philipp. Today we have something new in store for you. One of our Hong Kong correspondents with the Epoch Times just sat down with Alan Leong of the Hong Kong Civic Party to talk about what's really happening on the ground in Hong Kong. So stick around. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll get started now.
Thanks for taking the time to talk with us
Nice
today.
meeting you.
So I think the question on our minds and the question on many Western people's minds is what exactly is happening on the streets of Hong Kong?
Well, a little bit of history first. Hong Kong was a British colony for over 100 years. And we inherited from the British liberal democratic values like human rights, freedom, rule of law, and the way of life. We have freedom of speeches, expression, religion, and all that. Came 1997, the Chinese Communist Party, who is in charge of the People's Republic of China, wants to take this colony back and wants to resume exercising sovereignty over Hong Kong. So in the 1980s, there were discussions between the British and the Chinese. The product of those negotiations was the Sino-British Joint Declaration. And in that declaration, there were a few annexes, and one of the annexes spells out how the Chinese has promised to implement the contents of the Joint Declaration. And a document promulgated in 1990, that is 7 years before the reversion of sovereignty, called the Basic Law, came into being. And that Basic Law is the mini constitution of Hong Kong, and that provides for Hong Kong to remain unchanged culturally, politically, legally, and all the social fabrics would remain until 2047. That is the promise. From 1997 to today, there has been a lot of breaches by the Chinese Communist Party of the Basic Law. For example, we were promised universal suffrage in choosing our chief executive and all members of the legislature. But so far, we haven't had that yet. For example, we have a provision, Article 22 of the Basic Law, that provides for the Central People's Government not to interfere with Hong Kong domestic affairs, which are classified by the Basic Law as autonomous matters within our autonomy. But the Chinese Communist Party has its finger in every pie. What is happening on the ground in the last 6 months was triggered by an attempt by the Chief Executive, Carrie Lam, to amend our laws so as to enable her to send people who are physically in Hong Kong to be tried in mainland China. Now, this is an attempt to break the firewall constructed by the Basic Law and since 1997 to separate and keep distinct the two legal systems. The legal system in the mainland, of course, dealt with very famous people like Liu Xiaobo, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, who of course was not allowed by the CCP to go and collect his Nobel Prize, and a few years later died. So we don't want ourselves to be exposed to the threats of the Chinese legal system, which does not respect human rights, no parity of treatments, no due process, no independence of judiciary. So you can say that this is the last straw off the camel's back, which triggers a very deep awakening on the part of Hong Kong people. In the past 22 years, although there were breaches by the CCP of the Basic Law, it didn't have the effect of making Hong Kong people to reflect as deeply as on this occasion. So I would simply say awakening of Hong Kong people, that we really want to hold the Chinese Communist Party to its promises made about 30 years ago for Hong Kong to remain as we were before 1997 until 2047. 6 months past witnessed a freedom movement of Hong Kong people trying to get back what we have always been promised under the Basic Law.
So, at the time of the British-Sino Joint Declaration, were there any mechanisms put in place that would hold people who breached the declaration to account? For example, were there any legal mechanisms put in place if China weren't aligned with the agreement? And if so, have these been followed, or have they been nullified?
The Sino-British Joint Declaration is a document registered with the United Nations. And I still remember in 1986, I think, many leading countries in liberal democracies of the world came out to endorse it and to really praise the ingenuity of the Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping for having come up with such a novel idea. Because come to think of it, you are now returning 7 million people who have been practicing liberal democratic values and institutions to a communist regime that practices totally different ideologies, different institutions, different core values. So I would think that if it is such an international treaty endorsed by so many in the liberal democratic world and registered with the United Nations, remedies must be available in the United Nations armory of procedures for this to be taken up if one side to that bargain breaches that joint declaration. But so far, the British has not taken the Chinese to the United Nations for breaches to be addressed and damage redressed.
And can I ask, have you seen these freedoms and these promises slowly being eroded over time? This, of course, isn't just something that happened just yesterday or even just this year. Have you seen it being eroded up until this year? And if you have, what has the Hong Kong's people's response to this erosion been?
Now, over the 22 years after reversion of sovereignty in 1997, there have been time and again many breaches of the Basic Law, but not as seriously as on this occasion when they tried to send us back to stand trial in the mainland. For example, in the past, there had been breaches of Articles 45 and 68, which promised us universal suffrage in the election of the chief executive and all members of the legislature. In Hong Kong, of course, think that it is really necessary for an accountable government to be returned by universal suffrage. because this is no longer the Brits that are in control. During colonial era, of course, we don't have democracy, we don't have universal suffrage, but the British, as the colonial master, they will have to be answerable back home in London to the Parliament, and the Parliament practices all the liberal democratic values, and they respect institutions of liberal democracies. Came 1997, after reversion of sovereignty, we now have a sovereign that practices communism, and also what the Communist Party calls people's democratic dictatorship. And there is no separation of powers in the mainland. So during the 22 years from 97 to now, although many of us think that it is necessary for universal suffrage to be implemented in Hong Kong, there are about 40% of Hong Kong population who do not really care. They are too busy earning their living, and they think, well, with or without democracy, we would be living more or less in the same way. And for example, there are also other instances of breach. For instance, we have the Central People's Government's liaison office in Hong Kong interfering with Hong Kong's autonomy by trying to affect the voting intentions of legislative councillors. They rigged the general elections of the Legislative Council and the District Councils by planting their votes here and there. We also have the Communist Party infiltrating into the government organs, taking up, buying up media organizations, be it television stations or printed media. And you may recall that in the year 2003, there was this very historic march of 500,000 people on our streets to protest against the making of the National Security Ordinance, which is required by Article 23 of the Basic Law. Now, I've given you a handful of examples of breaches over the past 22 years. But on none of those occasions, Hong Kong people were dawned to the need to stand up for our own core values, human rights, freedom, liberties, and the rule of law as an institution. On this occasion, our personal safety and freedom is at stake. There has been so much cross-border business going on in terms of investment, money, people, and commodities. So as soon as Carrie Lam is putting that bill before the legislature, with the effect of enabling Carrie Lam to send us back to stand trial in that system that dealt with all these rights lawyers, Liu Xiaobo, we were very anxious, worried, and concerned. Now, that was why people started this very deep awakening process. Suddenly make sense of all the breaches in the past 22 years. On one occasion, one group may think, oh, that doesn't concern me. But now, on this occasion, Why it becomes the final straw? It is because it affects every person who is physically in Hong Kong, including even foreigners. Now, in fact, in the past decade or so, I have been making a lot of visits to liberal democracies like the European Union, European Parliament, to UK, to Canada, to United States. I have been telling our friends in liberal democracies that you should watch out for the threat of the Chinese Communist Party. But a decade ago, they did not lend me their ears, at least not enough to make me feel that they are taking me seriously. In the last 2 years, especially after the umbrella movement in 2014 and the 79 days of Occupy, it seems that the liberal democratic world is also suddenly dawned to this CCP threat. Hong Kong experience, in a way, resonates with them better. For example, when I was telling them how the Chinese Communist Party had been rigging our elections, well, then they resonated by saying, oh, in fact, similar things are happening back home here in United States, because they really think the Chinese are also trying to direct public opinion towards the direction that the Chinese would want candidates supported by the CCP would eventually win elections. When I talked about how the CCP has been buying up media companies in Hong Kong, how the CCP has been using the financial and the business opportunities to control people, to make them obey orders from Beijing. All these become more and more, making more and more sense to them. You see, that is my feeling. And my message to liberal democracies in my recent visits is invariably this. 18 years ago, you endorsed China's accession to WTO, the World Trade Organization. By engaging China in business and trade, you would one day be able to lure the Chinese Communist Party to adopting the same rules-based game that liberal democracies have been practicing. But what you failed to do is that you failed to police compliance by the CCP of the rules of the game. And now you have nurtured a monster so big and so influential, so powerful, that you are now afraid of offending the CCP. And I have been telling our friends in liberal democracies, well, you can do business with CCP, with China, but you do not have to do business on CCP's terms and conditions. Why do you want to own up your intellectual property rights, knowing that after a decade you will be forced out of China and without remedy? You can protect yourself. In today's world order, it seems that there are really two diametrically different ideologies, core values and institutions competing against each other. At the one end of the pole, you have liberal democratic model. At the other end of the pole, you have the China model. In short, the China model is authoritarian, dictatorial, promises to deliver economic results, right? But people under the China model will not enjoy liberties, freedom, human rights, rule of law, and the way of life in such a model will be very different from liberal democratic model. Hong Kong, in the past century or so, has become a genuine member of liberal democracies of the world. We share the same core values, the same core institutions. That Hong Kong is the only city in China that practices liberal democratic values and observing and implementing all liberal democratic institutions. Now, when you have these two ideologies competing against each other at the two ends of the pole, Hong Kong really is at the center. Right? We, being a Chinese city, practices liberal democratic values and institutions. This is how unique we are. And if we go down in this democratic freedom movement, it is very symbolic, because then President Xi and the Chinese Communist Party will then be saying to liberal democracies of the world, look here, this city called Hong Kong that has been practicing your institutions and values for the past century and earned your trust and confidence is now all the core values and institutions of the China model. And therefore, the CCP can say to liberal democracies of the world, well, I told you, did I not, that the China model must prevail over liberal democracies, given time. And this I would actually call the spell of inevitability. And if Hong Kong goes down in this freedom movement, then this spell of inevitability would be one step closer to being realized. So it is really this important. So I have been telling friends in European Parliament, in European Union, in London, in Paris, and in New York and DC, that if you really want to sustain liberal democratic values and institutions, it is almost now or never. If you leave the CCP to its own devices for the next decade, then after 10 years, you will find yourself to be defenseless, completely at CCP's mercy. Learn from the Hong Kong experience, because we have been dealing with this giant for at least 22 years, if you count from 1997. And we have our experience to share. We have what has been happening on the ground to illustrate and to demonstrate to you how the CCP can go about taking over all these institutions and values. So, in fact, all I'm saying to liberal democracies of the world is that, you should have a concerted effort trying to negotiate with the CCP so that business from now on will be done not only on CCP's terms, but on terms of liberal democracies of the world. You have to have leaders who are visionary enough to come up with a game plan which is coherent and all players in liberal democracies would act in concert, you should be helping Hong Kong to defend the same sets of values and institutions that you have been practicing. In doing so, you are not only just helping us, Hong Kong, but you are helping yourselves.
And so these points, of course, are very interesting, and it seems like many intellectuals, like yourself, have been aware of this for many years now and have seen it coming or seen it happening over time. And of course, when the straw finally broke the camel's back, could you just go through maybe the timeline from the introduction of the extradition bill up until now, and how the people in Hong Kong have reacted to this?
Well, in fact, what happened during the last 6 months is, of course, very traumatic to Hong Kong people. But it is also wake-up call, not only for Hong Kong people, but liberal democratic world. It all got started in February when Carrie Lam first introduced this extradition amendment bill into the Legislative Council in Hong Kong. Some of the cross-border traders already sounded out their concerns and anxieties. The rest, the majority of Hong Kong population, was still warming up to it. Because Carrie Lam started off by cheating people to say, oh, there was this omission, as if it had been negligently omitted during the reversion of sovereignty talks for Hong Kong people to be sent back to mainland for trial. So her rhetoric, initial rhetoric was, oh, a Hong Kong boy killed his Hong Kong girlfriend in Taiwan, right? So we obviously want the ends of justice to be served, and we have to amend our extradition laws so as to enable us to send this boy back to Taiwan for trial. Carrie Lam was trying to be clever and wanted to lump mainland China into it so that the amendment would, once done, would not only allow this boy to be sent back to Taiwan, but also to the whole of mainland China. Now, with some explanation from the Hong Kong Bar Association, from some ex-judges, from even the Law Society, and also many professional bodies who had frequent dealings with the mainland counterparts, more and more Hong Kong people began to see the threat. As soon as that has been explained to them, and as soon as they understand it, they were all jolted into action. Oh, this can't be right, because this firewall is meant to remain between the two systems at least until 2047. And you are now taking the war away. Came the 9th of June, 1 million people marched the streets of Hong Kong, calling for Carrie Lam to withdraw the bill. But she ignored 1 million people. And in fact, on the very night, even before the march ended, Carrie Lam issued a statement to say, I would batch on with it on the 12th of June with the second and third readings of the bill to take place in the Legislative Council. So on the 12th of June, some protesters actually used some violence in preventing the pro-government legislators to go into the Legislative Council to vote for this bill. And the whole of the thoroughfares outside the Legislative Council had been occupied by protesters. And the police actually, for the first time, opened fire on the protesters. So that was the 12th of June. On the 15th of June, Carrie Lam announced that this bill would be temporarily suspended. Now, she did not use the word withdrawn, because we have been calling for a withdrawal of the bill, but she did not use the word withdraw. Probably she was still thinking that, well, maybe there would come a time that I could reintroduce it into the Legislative Council, and she did not want to start all over again from step one. So she just used the words temporarily suspended. We did not accept that. So on the 16th of June, 2 million marched the streets of Hong Kong. And the rest is, of course, history. Right? After the 9th of June, Hong Kong has been the focus of attention of the free world, because this freedom movement has touched so many peoples in liberal democracies in the free world that they actually feel what is happening in Hong Kong is happening to them. Maybe not at the same time, but Hong Kong, today's Hong Kong, can be there tomorrow. So there has been a lot of these resonances coming from all over the liberal democratic world in particular. People were writing songs for us, sending their well wishes our way, and national and international parliaments and legislatures were extending their invitations to people like me and also the young protesters for them to go and explain to them what is happening to Hong Kong and how can liberal democracies help. As we are sitting here talking, we still do not see how this saga is going to resolve itself. It seems that Carrie Lam is no longer driving, although he is still in the driving seat. Every decision, insofar as it concerns the government position in how to deal with the freedom movement, has to come from Zhongnanhai, has to come from Beijing, from Xi Jinping, the president. I can tell you as a matter of certainty is that because the awakening about CCP's treacherous breaches of the basic law has been so deeply felt by Hong Kong people that unless we see that the CCP will go back to what it has promised us by the basic law, it is very difficult to see this whole saga end with peace and long-lasting stability.